Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to have with me today Aydin from Fellow App. Aydin was gracious enough to join us this morning to chat a little bit about customer retention or employee retention, kind of enabling the remote modern workplace with Fellow App, and kind of give some insight into some of the experiences he's had running a B2B SaaS business multiple times. So Aydin has some great experience. I'm excited to chat with him today and talk a little bit more about those things. And Aydin, why don't you give us a little bit of background on you and Fellow App?
So glad to be able to do this. I think this should be lots of fun. So my quick background is I've just been an entrepreneur my whole life. Been starting businesses since probably as far back as I was maybe 13 years old. But really, before this, I had another company that was in the online service space. It was called Fluidware. And so it was a company that we grew to just about 100 people and then sold it to SurveyMonkey. So went through that process of, bootstrapping, getting a company to a point where, it was, revenue positive. We had over 10 million in annual sales and profitable, and then going through that acquisition process. And so the reason that that's relevant is because when going through that process, that's originally when we came up with the idea for our current company, which is Fellow. And as we were growing that company, one of the things that we realized was that there's software for every walk of life. And the one thing that still didn't exist before we started Fellow was software just for managers of teams. And so, it didn't exist. We decided to create it. And so that's kind of the origins of Fellow. And today, obviously at Fellow, having a lot of fun. We just recently launched and starting to basically ramp up growth and users.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think it makes a lot of sense. We put out some, Cloud App put out some data a couple weeks ago in this state of collaboration report, and it talked about how 57% of Gen Z and around 50% of millennial generations are working from home or remotely the majority of the time. And obviously, like startups, a lot of them build remotely. Big companies that are based in the Bay Area, people don't want to fight traffic and things. And so you have to create tools like Fellow and Cloud App and others to really try and connect, visually and collaboratively, digitally, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. It's such an important thing. I feel like, the more and more technology there is, to support the model, the more and more it starts to happen. Like all those friction points, like the little things that prevent you from being able to run distributed teams, all that friction starts to disappear. And, I think, I can relate to this in a bunch of different ways, even in the non-remote standpoint. One of the interesting things for us was, as you're growing a company and you're first starting out, like everybody's in the same room, you can kind of like, turn your head and speak to the next person.
Yep.
And that kind of works for a while. But then, the team starts to grow. And then all of a sudden, maybe you're 2 rows of seats and then 3 rows and 4 rows. And before you know it, you have a whole floor. Now there's some people who are on one side and then there's people on the other side of the floor. And before you know it, now you're on 2 floors and then 3 floors. And then you'll notice that the people are on the first floor don't talk to the people on the 3rd floor. And then you get the second location like us, you get acquired. And so now you're part of this company that has offices in like 7 or 8 different locations. And
Right.
A lot of people work from home and a lot of people are in different offices. So yes, there's this kind of work from home, concept. Yes, there's this kind of remote concept. But I just want to emphasize the fact that companies now are understanding that they can have multiple locations faster. Like it's totally okay for you to be 3 people in one city and 10 people in another city, because technology actually allows for those sorts of things to happen. So this concept of remote applies to so much more than maybe just the narrow framing of the word remote may seem to some people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We're kind of in that framework here at Cloud App where we have HQ is technically in the Bay Area, but our largest office is here in Utah, where I am. And so, and then we have, people remote all over kind of the world. And so, we kind of live in the same type of world. It's creates that opportunity to connect still digitally over video conference and other things. With kind of like this growth and, like collaborative productivity apps, other things, how have you kind of gone about cutting through that noise and that distraction with providing like a good experience or just a really clean onboarding path with Fellow? I know you guys just recently launched, so it's kind of obviously still ongoing, but what is kind of your thought process at the beginning?
So a couple of things. So we've just launched, but we've been in beta for a long time, and so we were one of those products that kind of existed, had a bunch of customers, had a bunch of revenue, even during the beta phase. So we've been just doing this for quite a while. But I think there's a couple of things that become necessary, right? So the second that you have a distributed workforce, that means that obviously people are working on different timeframes. Some people like to come in at certain times. They like to stop working and then maybe start working again later at night. Sometimes you're at different time zones. And so one of the things about that is that, concepts like instant messaging or just like phoning people stops to work as well. So the next time that you're trying to send a message and it might be, 9 a.m. your time, if you're on the East Coast and you're thinking, oh, that's like 6 a.m. on the West Coast, like maybe I should hold off on this message. So I think Fellow capitalizes on that, and all of the kind of collaborative software products that allow for asynchronous communication, cloud app included, kind of allow for that use case to be more prevalent. So our view with Fellow is, and because we're so focused on helping people have better interactions through meetings, one of the things for us is like, I could message Joe right now, but we're meeting tomorrow at 3 p.m. So I'm just going to put this in my agenda for tomorrow. And when I go to my agenda for tomorrow, I see that Joe also put in a bunch of things that he wants to talk about. And so with Fellow, everybody's creating these collaborative agendas all the time. And so it's not just about like the second that you think about something, let me message that person right away. It's, hey, let's actually be very good about this and create these collaborative agendas with people that I meet with teams that I meet with. And so that when we do actually meet, we can then talk about all these things in a super efficient manner. Our meetings become more effective, and just like the way that an organization communicates becomes better.
Yeah, it really brings up a really unique mindfulness opportunity exercise that I think we're all trying to fit into with Slack and text and email and social and so many notifications kind of bombarding us. So I think it's a really unique way to kind of know that you've got something, and you can use Fellow to kind of table that idea, get it out of your mind, but not necessarily have to send an email or whatever. Just set it up for the next meeting.
Yeah. And by the way, like this stuff, it's really interesting. I think, if you go back really far back and, you read books like The Effective Executive, right? Classic book in management, Drucker. And even in that book and like in that time frame, like people have been recommending for the longest periods that you should really have a notebook set aside. And in that notebook, you maybe have multiple pages. You have one page, say, for each direct report, and then you have a page for your sales meeting, and then another one for your marketing meeting. Mm-hmm. And so the idea is like every time you think of something that you need to follow up with someone about or talk to someone about, like write it in the appropriate section in that notebook and table it away. And so like this common workflow, and we think the people who are the most efficient in communication like use that workflow. And one of the things Fellow does is just make stuff like that easier. But what makes these things necessary, obviously, like in the kind of remote and distributed use case, is that for those users who work in those environments, the complexity that they have to operate on from a communication level is so much higher. So one of the rules of thumb around this is that if you are a remote or distributed team, you have to operate at roughly 5 times the complexity of your equivalent counterpart that's all in the same office. So what that means is like if you're a team of 20 people and you're all distributed, you have to develop the communication, basically processes and procedures of a 100-person company. So if you were 100 people and all in the same location, you would eventually have to get better at communicating and build more processes around that. But because you're a remote team, you just have to develop that stuff a lot earlier. Now, it turns out there's a lot of benefits to having that rigor around communicating and working better together. And so remote teams are by necessity needing to develop those things earlier, but it's also a really good thing because they would have had to get there as they scaled anyway. So there is that positive angle. You have to be more proactive, but you would have to do that anyway as you scaled. So might as well get that done right away.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I thought you could provide kind of a unique insight. You know, we talk a lot about customer experience on these live broadcasts and on this podcast. And I think you could provide a unique angle on employee experience. How do you think, or how do you guys kind of envision Fellow and, you know, apps that it kind of improve this collaboration, really improving that employee experience and helping, you know, SaaS companies or small startups to all the way up to, you know, the enterprise companies retain those their employees a little better? Yeah.
I mean, it's a great question. It's all about the people. Every company is always about all the people. But the second that you're more distributed or you're more remote, you have to do more things. So if you and I were sitting next to each other in the same office all the time, you could argue, and it's still, you know, basic things like, say, a one-on-one meeting, you know, something that managers and their employees should do all the time. You know, a lot of people in smaller companies, you know, that we talk to sometimes say, yeah, you know, like we can see the importance of it, but we kind of sit next to each other, and, you know, it's kind of weird to then go into a room and you know, just basically have this one-on-one meeting, like we sit next to each other the whole day. Yeah. So at Fellow, we have part of our job is to convince those people that no, a one-on-one is completely different, and you should absolutely still have them, even if you're sitting next to each other, because when you're in a room, you can ask all sorts of different questions, like, how do you feel about like your career growth? Are you going to ask that out in the open when the person's sitting right next to you?
Totally.
Probably not, right?
A little more private.
And if you did, the person would probably respond, good, I think, you know, so it's still necessary. So we have at Fellow, one of our jobs is to make sure that everybody understands this concept of one-on-ones, as an example. But in the remote use case, I mean, there's no excuse. Like, I sure hope that all of the remote and distributed managers in the world out there are meeting with their direct reports on a weekly or a bi-weekly basis. And they're doing that very consistently. And hopefully they're using something like Fellow to basically track those things. But at the very minimum, they should be happening. And it's especially important for things like that to happen because you start to lose connection to what the organization is, what's going on, the information, and just like having that repertoire and like that basically the rapport between like the working relationship that you have with your teams. But on top of that, there's other things that you need to do. So for example, it makes sense that say that the marketing team and the sales team should communicate. Like that's probably a good idea, that they should not be silos. So once you start to be a remote team and maybe these teams are in different locations, like that connect needs to be something that you need to go out of your way to actually establish. Things like all hands meetings become even more important because this is an opportunity for people from all the different offices to actually participate in and ask the questions and learn what's going on in the company. So all these like special types of meetings that are just good for company culture and communication anyway, just become so much more important the second that you have team members that are not all in the same room. So basic things like, say, hallway conversations that just happen and people kind of build rapport that way, like even those sorts of things now won't happen. So you have to do more things and you have to put more processes in place to make up for the lack of those things that might have happened naturally if people were around the office. Ultimately, like the stronger the bonds between not just managers and their teams, but peers with each other, you know, the better those teams start to work together. So ultimately, like if you want your teams to gel well together and to be able to really build on each other's strengths and get the most out of like what that team can accomplish together, you have to put in these processes to make sure that this communication and those meetings actually do happen.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. You've got to really focus on that culture and really make it a part of who your company is, and people can kind of buy into that. One thing I loved that Adobe did when I was there was something called a check-in. And it was kind of like removing performance reviews and doing it on a quarterly basis. And so like when I was, managing people, I kind of knew what to expect from those meetings. They were going to be talking about salary and career development and new challenges and other things, really focused on the employee. And then for me, the same to like my, who I reported to. They knew that I was going to kind of come in with feedback on management, or, it was really like a safe place to talk about things that were not tactical and day to day. And I think, like what you said, fellow, and really kind of fits into that connecting and putting that, hopefully making that effort from a manager and executive perspective a little easier to connect to those dots.
Yeah, 100%. I think like ultimately what you start to realize that as you start to build larger and larger companies is that it's all about the people. It's all about the relationships. It's all about understanding how each person works, what are their strengths, their weaknesses, what they like, what they dislike, how they're at their best, when they're at their best, what you need to do to unblock them in different scenarios. It's just all those things. And those things aren't, something that you can just figure out by looking at someone. It's a lot of work. You have to put in the effort. You have to put in the time. You have to put in the processes to make sure that those things happen on an ongoing basis. And then the other thing is like, if you're a CEO or you're an executive at those sorts of companies, it's not just enough for you to make sure that you do that with your team. Now you have this added responsibility of like, how do I make sure that this is actually happening in my organization and it's happening all the time? It's not something that we pay lip service to. This is how basically teams operate in like your company. And so, again, like I think this is all the greatest companies kind of understand this. And the advantage that distributed teams have is that they have to figure this stuff out faster. And I think it's actually a strategic advantage for that reason.
Yeah, I really like that point. I think it's a nice like bow to put on kind of remote work, that there are some advantages that of smaller companies that may start remote kind of have to build that culture quicker and be kind of scrappy to kind of create that connection, which can form a nice foundation for when you do have the 100 people on the same floor.
Yeah, 100%. I think like it's almost like I hate to put it this way, but it's almost like a crutch. The ability to be in the same office allows you to be sloppier than you would be if you were not in the same office. And so it just means that there has to be more clarity. There has to be better goals. There has to be all these things, because otherwise, you just can't get into a room randomly and start talking about, hey, so you just have to have a lot more rigor. And I think ultimately all companies should have that. You don't need to be remote in order to have those things. Great companies do that even when they're 5 people and they're all in the same room. But it's just like, it's a forcing function. And so it requires people to operate at a higher level of communication efficiency, from the get-go.
Definitely. One last kind of question. It's a little bit unrelated to the path that we kind of went down, but right. I love kind of what we've talked about. I think it's been great. What do you think is kind of the future of what does the modern workplace look like now, and what does it kind of look like 5 years from now?
Yeah, so I think the main thing that's going to start happening is I feel that one of the things is we've gone very like hardcore fast towards this concept of real time everything. And this can be problematic because, in the sense that like everyone is bombarded with notifications. We kind of started in a world where, first email existed, and then there was lots of email, and then like email was flooded and everyone has an email problem. And now what's happened is like we have so many more ways to communicate. And a lot of those ways to communicate have presented, notification overload. And I think we all live in this notification overload like environment. And I think that's one of the things that we need to solve. And I think 5 years from now, things become a lot more structured. People communicate better and much more efficiently. Communications will turn to be more effective because people, again, know when to communicate on what channels and when. So a lot of this stuff has to be figured out. What we're hearing is that a lot of people, for example, are resorting to using messaging platforms almost like email, in the sense that they will, check these message platforms, say once at 9, once at noon, and like once at 5, versus like that instant aspect of it.
Yep.
It's just like this desire to basically communicate in a more, effective pace that kind of gets away at basically reducing clutter and focusing on like more effective communication. I think that's one of the main things to unlock even more productivity across organizations everywhere.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. Well, thanks for joining us today, Aydin. It was awesome talking to you about kind of remote future of work and how things are looking. Excited to kind of test out Fellow, and definitely take a look if anyone is, in the market for some improvement of employee engagement and really connecting the management to employee base.
Yeah, definitely. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks, man.